Professor Edward H. Livingston。Professor Livingston 是伽马副主编，2003年任德克萨斯大学西南医学院胃肠道及内分泌外科教授兼主任，2007年被聘德克萨斯大学西南医学院生物医学工程的研究生课程主席，并担任该大学外科教授。2017年在加州大学洛杉矶分校担任外科学教授，发表超过245篇高质量论文。Professor Livingston 的演讲题目是 Enhancing Confidence in Chinese Clinical Research. Welcome, Professor Livingston. Welcome.
Thank you. Okay. I'd like to thank you for having me speak with you today. As was mentioned earlier, I spent 12 years as a JAMA editor, and 3 of those were part-time, 9 of them full-time. And in that time, I handled more than 4,000 manuscripts. I took about more than 1,000 papers all the way to publication, and was in editors' meetings where we discussed more than 5,000 clinical trials. And the importance of that is that I have a pretty good sense for what it takes to get published in the very high impact general medical journals. And what those journals are all looking for are randomized clinical trials. If you have a well-performed randomized clinical trial, they will take you very seriously. They're much less interested in meta-analyses. Some journals like the New England Journal of Medicine won't even publish meta-analyses. And when they're looking for things to publish, at least at our table at JAMA, we would ask the following questions. Will the results of this study change clinical practice? Is it an important discovery? And also importantly, for a high-profile journal, is it going to get cited by other authors and affect the impact factor? I have the next few slides which show the results of a little study I did while I was an editor, and I listed the causes, the reasons that we rejected papers that were being, at the time, taken very seriously for publication at JAMA. So you can see there's a smattering of things like missing data or the findings not being generalizable, trials that were terminated early, not novel, a qualitative outcome, etc. So you should have copies of these slides. You can look at these lists at your leisure. I've been asked to speak about this topic, about the credibility of Chinese science in the Western world, because of articles like this. There are a lot of articles in the Western literature questioning the science. I know from our perspective at JAMA, one of the things that we were concerned about was aligned with this statement: because institutions and individual researchers stand to benefit greatly from their elevated reputations, no severe punishments have been imposed for academic corruption or malpractice compared with the US and Japan, meaning that if malfeasance occurs, if somebody has done something wrong in China, we don't really think that they suffer the same kinds of consequences that they do in the Western world. And for that reason, there's some skepticism about publishing Chinese science and Chinese authors in the big journals. So the problems that we had when investigating, when considering Chinese science, is we didn't know the investigators. A lot of people that we publish in a journal like JAMA are publications from people that we know. They're in the Western world. We deal with them all the time. We may know them personally. But when something comes from China, we know neither the investigator or the institution. And because we don't know much about the institution, we don't know if that institution will provide a recourse for us if there's a problem with the paper. We have no way to know that the data are accurate. And oftentimes it seems like the paper was submitted to the journal because of its high impact factor. And it'd be sometimes very clear that the author submitting a manuscript had never even looked at our journal. But because we know that around the world, publishing in high impact factor journals is so important, we would get a lot of papers sent to us that just didn't fit into our journal at all because of our impact factor. So how to improve the situation? One theme that I'm going to have here is develop relationships with Western investigators, and I'll start here. Before you do your study, you should have a relationship with credible Western investigators who have a good reputation, who can help you design your study. You want to work with them to make sure the study is designed for this consistent with the standards of the journals that you want to publish in, and make sure that those studies are not just follow-on studies to other ones that have already been published. You're going to want to make sure that the study you perform is novel and that it is properly designed and executed. One of the problems that I see when people send me papers from China and ask me if they think it's publishable in the high impact factor journals is that the studies themselves were poorly designed. The research topic wasn't novel enough for those journals. And even though the rest of it might be okay, those two factors alone keep them from getting published in these journals. Once you have done a study, you're going to submit it to a journal. Make sure that you follow the journal standards. Look at the journal, look at the author's instructions, look at what they've published before on that topic, and make sure that your paper conforms with that journal standards. You also must make sure that it's written and edited consistent with native English. Unless somebody is absolutely fluent in English, you should get a native English speaker to edit your papers. It's very, very difficult to read papers that don't have good language usage. And I know that in my own experience that we would just reject those papers no matter what they said, because it's just too much effort to try to understand what they're trying to communicate. Make sure you follow the scientific standards for your own discipline and for that of the journal. If there isn't a professional product, so it's written in poor English, there's spelling or grammar errors, the manuscript structure is wrong for the journal, there's obvious methodological or analytic flaws, the journal editors will lose confidence in the science itself. And that's something that you want to avoid. They assume that if you're sloppy with the manuscript, you're sloppy with your science, and they will reject you out of hand. And sometimes people develop a reputation for that, and they wind up never getting published in these journals because as soon as they see the name of the author, they'll just reject the paper, assuming that the work is sloppy. All scientific papers should follow this general format. And I have a whole talk just on this, but I actually have several talks just on this. But just briefly, the introduction should be very brief, about 300 words, only 3 paragraphs. Avoid self-promotion, which means citing yourself in your previous studies, and state a hypothesis in the 3rd paragraph. The methods should be detailed enough to repeat the study by someone else, have a defined primary outcome variable, a well-defined primary outcome variable, and a detailed sample size calculation with a minimal clinically important difference based on some previous literature or good rationale for why you picked that number for the minimal clinically important difference. The results should provide confidence intervals. You should avoid reliance on p-values. You may report them, but make sure you report them along with confidence intervals. The discussion should be relatively brief. The conclusion should follow the data, and you should be modest. When you're looking at a journal, look at what that journal has published on the topic before. Cite relevant articles from that journal. Journal editors spend a lot of time on their own journal, and if they have published in that field and you haven't cited what they know they published, they're going to reject your paper because they want to know that you have paid attention to what they're doing and that your paper is the next logical piece of science that should occur after the science that they have reported in their journal before. And use the nomenclature that journal uses. So I'm looking at a couple of papers for people in China right now, and they're using older nomenclature that the journal, obviously, if you look at the papers published in that topic in the last 10 years, they've changed the way they use terminology. If you use the correct terminology, the journal editor will understand and recognize that you are paying attention to their journal. I mentioned this before. We know that if you're just searching for a high impact factor journal, and you haven't paid attention to what the journal actually publishes, it's going to get rejected. Now, how do you develop these relations? You should go to meetings. You should travel to the countries where there are other scientists and editors that you want to know, and and develop relationships with other scientists and editors. You should work with known investigators in the Western world outside of China. That will help a lot. You should encourage collaboration with other research groups doing similar work to yours. Develop an environment of openness to how your science is performed in China. Currently, it's too opaque, and that's created some mistrust, especially in the last year or two. You should collaborate with those investigators, but avoid big names and famous institutions of people that you don't really know. I've seen a lot of papers from China. They develop a relationship, a superficial relationship with somebody at like Harvard or Yale or something like that, but it's obvious from the work product and that person doesn't really work very closely with those investigators. So it's better to develop a close relationship with somebody who will actually help you rather than what their name is or where they're from. I spoke to a couple of Chinese nationals who are now working in the West and asked them the question that is the topic of this discussion, which is what could be done to increase the confidence of the Western world? And these people are particularly qualified because they've done science in China and they're doing science in the West now. One relatively young investigator said, make raw data publicly available, travel to the West and give talks at meetings and at institutions to promote a better understanding of Chinese science in the West, improve the quality of Chinese clinical research by improving patient follow-up. This particular person said it's known in China, it's very hard to follow patients longitudinally. That's a major weakness in Chinese science, and that's something that you should concentrate on. This is from a senior investigator who came to the West actually relatively at mid-career and has been in the West now for about 20, 25 years and runs actually a huge research operation in the West. This person said, be respectful for the science, build self-reputation by working hard, and be patient. It takes a lot of years to do this. Have reputable collaborators outside of China. They should be available to pre-review manuscripts before you submit them. Submit high-quality manuscripts. Make sure your manuscripts are absolutely perfect before you send them out. Use professional English writing services and use plagiarism checking software. And that's what I have for you today. I hope you found this informative. We are very anxious to work with Chinese investigators, help them do science that's consistent with what we do in the West, and help you get published in our best journals. Thank you very much.